Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Dr. Samara Rasmussen. I'm the dissertation writing specialist in the Online Campus Writing Center, and I'm really looking forward to a great conversation tonight about some of the updates from the seventh edition APA. We're going to go through a number of items that are important to know as you get ready to start the fall term. My colleague, Lydia Bailey, is also here, and she'll be presenting some of the material as well. And we're going to trade off managing the chat and questions. So really quickly about me, I got my doctorate in organizational change and leadership from the University of Southern California. And I previously worked as a director of admissions at a university, and part of my role there was to help graduate students with their doctoral papers. And then throughout my own doctoral program, I was a peer reviewer and helped my colleagues write their dissertations. And now I work part-time for Chicago School of Professional Psychology, conducting individual chapter reviews for dissertations. I also have done a number of webinars for the Writing Center, as well as supported the Writing Center in some different ways. I've been with Chicago School since 2018, and I've probably reviewed easily 100 to 200 chapters during my time here. So Lydia, do you want to hop on real quick and introduce yourself, and then we'll dig into the material?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Lydia Bailey, and I am a peer tutor at the Writing Center. I am a doctoral candidate in the online international psychology program. So I'm where some of you are and where some of you may hopefully end up. I am writing my chapters, and so I look forward to presenting tonight. And please don't hesitate to type in your questions into the chat so we can make sure that we answer any questions you might have. I know that when I found out the 7th edition was coming out, I thought, oh, great, right in the middle of what I'm doing. But honestly, the 7th edition is really helpful and easy. The changes are really positive, and I'm excited to share those with you guys today.
Great, thanks, Lydia. And I couldn't agree more. The changes, when I first heard about 7th edition, I was like, oh my goodness, I just learned 6th edition. So here we go. But the changes really are for the better. They do make some things much easier and more consistent, and hopefully we'll show that. And I also want to say before we get going that writing in APA style and formatting, it really takes a lot of practice. It isn't necessarily natural writing, but through practice and asking for help, it really is easy to start doing things over and over through that practice. So again, and thanks again, Lydia, please don't hesitate to ask your questions as we go through. There's a lot of material here. All right, I believe that I am sharing my screen, and hopefully that is true. Let me know if it's not. So let's get started. Okay, so we're going to cover some key elements that are updates again to the 7th edition. And really, I guess I would encourage you to stop thinking about the difference between the 6th and the 7th. Really just focus on what we're going to learn and talk about today and just start moving forward. Again, a lot of these things are going to make a little bit more sense and they're going to be more consistent. So we're going to talk about numbers, abbreviations, quotation marks, how to do your spacing. We'll talk about headings, which is pretty important, really, and all of these things are applicable except for, and we'll make the distinction, all of these items are applicable whether we're talking about course papers or dissertations, except for a few things, and we'll make sure to highlight those. So your title page. You'll start about 3 to 4 lines, which are double spaced from the top of the page. So when you pull up your blank document, you just hit return about 4 times to insert your title. That is a centered element, it is bold, and it is title case. And we'll talk about what title case means in just a moment. About the title itself, it should, in pretty clear, concise language, summarize the main idea of the paper. It should identify the things that are being studied within the paper and any relationship that might exist. And you don't want your title to necessarily be long. There's no prescribed length. It's just focused and very concise. Then you're going to take a subset of that title and make it your running head in the dissertation. It is important to strive to avoid words that don't really add anything to the title, like a study of the relationship between variable A and variable B. You can just say relationship between variable A and variable B. That is a very concise summary of a paper. Then you'll go ahead and you'll hit return again after the title to then start with the main elements of the title page, starting with your full name. And this is true, the title of the paper, the dissertation, or the thesis, and then the student name. So whether it's a course paper or the dissertation. Pagination. This is new to the 7th edition, and it's something that I have been correcting quite a bit in some of the chapters I've been reviewing. You start on your title page with page 1. And I can actually, maybe when we're done going through the presentation, I can actually show how to do that, some of the mechanics behind it. But on that title page, you are going to start with 1. There is no pagination in the footer anymore. On dissertations for Chicago schools, the running head is still required. Back to pagination, there shouldn't be any section breaks in your paper, so you won't need to use that tool, but you can use the page break to begin your text at the top of a new page. That you would really do that from chapter to chapter or section to section. Try not to orphan a main level 1 heading or a chapter title on a page. You could just insert the page break, start that next major section on a clean page. Page numbers starting with page 1 will be in the upper right corner of the page header. And go ahead and use the automatic pagination tool. I would imagine most of you are probably using Word, MS Word. So just you can insert page number and let Microsoft Word do its job. So here's a sample of a title page for a course paper. You can see in the middle, the negative effects of being sleep deprived is the paper title. It is bold, it is centered, and it is title case. So what title case means is that the major words of the title or the heading are capitalized. There is no running head required for a course paper, but you can see here the page number in the upper right-hand corner, and that is true for all papers. The title is bold, there's an extra space, which means you hit return twice. No, yes, you hit return twice because you're already double spaced, and you're going to double space all of the elements on the title page. All right, I do want to check in. What questions do we have?
I don't see any questions just yet.
Okay, perfect.
Please feel free to jump on, you guys.
Yep, I just checking the chat and questions too. Make sure I didn't miss anything. A sample paper. So I do have some examples that I'm going to show, or both Lydia and I are going to show throughout the presentation. And then if we have time at the end, I will pull up a sample paper and show you some of the different elements. And then in the Writing Center, you can grab templates. Was there another question? Let's see. Oh, okay. All right. So heading levels. So heading levels are how you guide your reader through your paper or your dissertation. And course papers, for the most part, you're going to probably use level 1 and level 2. And then when you're in the dissertation, I would expect to see some level 3 headings. Level 4 and level 5 are less common, but this does show how to format them and how it looks. This is a new element in edition 7 where the format of the headings is a little bit more consistent. So every level of heading is bold, every level of heading is title case. Where things start to change is at the level 3, where you see it's italicized, but in edition 7, APA 7, the level 3 is the heading is on its own line, and then the paragraph begins underneath. That is new. Then level 4 and level 5 are sentence level headings, and so they will come in the text, in the narrative, with the paragraph that follows them. The other thing that's important to remember about headings is that a level 1 heading, the way that I try to remember it is that a level 1 heading is a main topic. And then you have your level 2 headings, which are typically subtopics of that main topic. But before you can move to a level 3 heading, you need to have 2 level 2 headings preceding it. If you were to move to a level 4 heading, you would have 2 level 3 headings preceding it. And I realize that's a little confusing for me to say, but I believe this is going to be shown here. And then again, if we have time at the end, I'm happy to show that. So again, the level 3 heading is now separated from the paragraph text. In edition 6, it was a sentence level heading. All of the headings are now title case and bold, which helps with consistency. It's the italics, and then on those sentence levels headings where they have a period that really is the difference. The hierarchy is still the same as it used to be, but it mentioned here is just a repeat where you need to have 2 or more subsections before you move to the next heading level. All right, were there questions about headings?
I don't see any questions.
All right, very good. All right, so the font. There are now some different accepted fonts with APA 7th edition. However, what's important to know is that for Chicago School dissertations, you should only use Times New Roman size 12 font. Now, for other class papers, the guidance is that it must be consistent. So if you'd go ahead and choose the Calibri, which is often the Microsoft Word default font when you open up a document, that's fine to use. However, all of the paper elements must be the same. So your page numbers, your running heads, your text, your figures, your references will all be in that Calibri font, and keep it consistent. So you can use the Calibri Arial Lucida Sans or the Times New Roman or the Georgia. But if you're writing a dissertation, Chicago School has decided that Times New Roman 12 point is the font for dissertations. Yes, the presentation is being recorded and it will be made available to you. All right. So spacing. One thing that's new in 7th edition, and I personally am absolutely struggling to break this habit, is now it is okay to just have one space after a punctuation mark. And I have grown up with 2 spaces, and I'm not sure if I'm ever going to break that habit. You can do a control find replace, or a find and replace, but I'm working to break my habit. So it is okay to do one space after a punctuation mark in the 7th edition. You are going to double space your entire paper, and most paper elements, that does include tables and figure notes, the appendices, the title page, your abstract, all of those elements should be double spaced in papers and in the dissertation. There are some exceptions. You're going to add an extra space between the title of your paper and the author name on the title page. If you're creating tables and figures, you may single space the material in those artifacts if it improves the readability. Often what that means is, particularly on tables, you want to strive to have your entire table, if you can, on one full page. Try not to orphan half the table on one page or the other. So if you can sort of manipulate that and make that table easier to read, then you can single space both in tables and figures. If you use footnotes, which are rather rare in APA style, they can be single space as well. And you don't need to add blank lines before or after headings, even if the heading falls at the end of the page. So if you do have a heading that's at the bottom of a page and you don't want to space and move it to the next page, that is acceptable in the 7th edition. Okay, so I do see a question about the single space after punctuation being required or optional. That is a really great question. Is it required or optional? Let me put it this way. If I'm reviewing your chapter, I'm probably not going to, I might point it out and indicate that it should be changed. I would probably defer to your chair or advisor or instructor to give you the guidance on whether that's required. It is a new expectation in APA 7th. So really, it probably needs to happen. I realize that's a very wishy-washy answer. Gabrielle or Lydia, do you want to jump in about whether that's required?
I would say that, especially in course papers, I would do that. I'm actually from the school that a single space is the way that you do it, and so when I review papers, I definitely point it out. Um, I think the biggest thing though is just to be consistent, because I know that lots of times there'll be I'll see papers that have one way in one paragraph and another way in another. So I think consistency is really going to be the key there.
Yeah, and I'm also getting a note from another colleague that it is required, and I think I agree with that it is required. But like Lydia said, I might mark it if I catch it. And what Lydia said is also true, that consistency is key. And then I do see another question about footnotes being discouraged. Are they now allowed? They're incredibly rare in APA style. I also work in Turabian where footnotes are encouraged. So that's a style thing. APA does not really use footnotes. There are some reasons why you might, and I'd be happy to follow up on that. But you're not going to be including much in footnotes. All right, I really do appreciate the questions. Please keep them coming. All right, so tables, oh, and I did see a question about double spacing in tables and figures. Let me go back to that question just a moment. Whoop, there we are. Okay, so the question was, please tell us when footnotes are allowed. They're really allowed when you need to, okay, so here's the question. The question was when footnotes are allowed. They're allowed when you need to include some information that it really doesn't make sense to include in the narrative, which again is incredibly rare. APA wants you to be including information in the narrative that belongs there. So if you have an example or specific questions, I'm happy to discuss. But again, footnotes are not really, they're not really used in APA style. And then here's a question about tables and figures. Can they be double spaced? Yes, they should be. And in most cases they will be. It's if you need to improve the readability of the artifact that you are allowed to single space. So here we have, I believe I'm showing now, table and figure examples. So I want to draw attention to the fact that now in APA 7th, the titles of the table and the figure are now at the top. They are bold, they are flush left, they are title case, and they are lowercase. There is no punctuation after the title of a table or a figure. Then there is the actual title in italics following the number of the table or the figure. The title itself is title case, which means all of the important words in that title are capitalized. And then we get into the actual table, which is on the left, or a figure, which is on the right. So on the table, please note that there are no border lines for each row or column. There are just horizontal lines that offset the headings. And then the content of the table is the columns are centered, they are not bold, and the information is presented as it would be in columns, which you'll use to create the table. You just won't use those border lines. Then you can see the note underneath the table. This is not a footnote. This is a note that follows a table to provide some citation information or some additional piece of information related to where this table has come from. So you might see in the note, which is italicized with a period, some citation information where this table came from. You might see a note saying permission to replicate, something like that. On the figure, on the right-hand side, we discussed the title, the italicized title, and then the figure itself, which, you know, it can be a picture. There's some different formats that you can use, and then a note. In this case, it's describing that this is a copyrighted figure. So there's somebody owns that figure, but it's being shared in this document. All right, so I want to check on questions. Let's see. Just a moment. Okay, let me see here. Okay. So in regard to the footnotes, it's like a memo to the writer. I guess I'm not sure what that means. You're probably not going to be using footnotes. So I guess if this means like a note to yourself as you're writing, that's certainly fine, but you'd remove those when you're submitting the paper. A section break when needing to change from portrait to landscape to add a table or a figure. You shouldn't, I would use the page break, not the section break to do that, and put the table or the figure on its own page. Is it okay to use the underline tool like we would the bold when doing the tables? I'm not sure what that means. You can use the underline to get the bottom horizontal line on the top row and then the bottom of the table, but you could also just use the bottom horizontal table. And I think I better show how to do this when we get to the end. So I'll make sure to show how to format a table and what tools I'm talking about for some clarity there. Okay, have I captured everything? Okay, I think I've got all the questions for the moment. Okay. All right, let's make sure we've covered everything. Yeah, so this is just some additional clarity around how tables and figures are now formatted similarly with the titles looking the same. Yeah, let's see. Yep, and everything is double spaced, although in a table you can single space if it makes that table more readable. You don't use the vertical table borders, you just do a horizontal border. And again, I'll show that in a few minutes at the end. That's correct. In the note, you can add in, again, a small piece of additional information that's relevant specifically to that figure, and is probably not something needed in the narrative. All right, so numbers. This is an interesting element of APA papers. So the general rule of thumb for numbers is that for numbers 10 and larger, they should be expressed as a number. And here's the example. So 11, 19, 204, 386, 500,000, 983, those are going to be expressed as numbers. This is generally speaking. Numbers 9 and lower are expressed as words. 1, 4, 8, you spell out the number. So numbers do get a little bit complicated, and you will get a copy of this. This information is in the Online Writing Center website, and it's also something that I provide. Well, actually, all of us writing support people, we provide this information to help because it does get kind of complicated. So you're going to use numbers when you're talking about statistic or mathematical functions, when you're talking about percentages, time, dates, ages, populations, money. Here are some examples so you can see them. So the first one, in 3 years, you would use the number 3 instead of the word 3. She scored 5 points because you're talking about a score, obviously. 75%, the percent symbol comes immediately after that number. An exception to this I can share is that when you start a sentence, say you were going to say 75% of people, then you would spell out in words 75%. If that is going to come at the beginning of a sentence, and that's just a little nuance. So again, you're going to get this, and we can talk more about this, but numbers can be a little bit tricky. All right, I'm going to wrap up my turn by talking about lists, and then Lydia will share some of the additional material that's coming up. And again, I'll show how to create a table and some other paper elements in the time that we'll have left. So for a list, it's important to use lowercase. You can use the lowercase letters when the order of a series within a list is important. So things need to be in a certain order. So the example here is where you see these small a, small b, small c, is that in this reading strategy order, the order of these elements is important. So they are given the ordering letters. This is a bulleted list, and in a bulleted list or a number, you use a number list if you're going to have a complete sentence or a paragraph in your list. For phrases, as we see here, you can use bullets or lowercase letters, and that's a little bit of a nuance. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Lydia, but before I do, Lydia, if you don't mind, I'll check the questions and we will switch it over. Okay. The notes section is always single spaced. Yes, it is on figures and tables. That's correct. Okay. All right, Lydia. And I'll monitor the chat and questions for you.
All right. So the next thing is abbreviations. We use this pretty often in APA writing, but you're going to want to write out the full name the first time it appears in the paper, and then you follow it with the abbreviation in the parentheses. So an example would be, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, with the parentheses CDC, that's what you're going to use throughout your paper. There are some others, like in your paper, you're going to go on to use the abbreviation. So this is something that I actually correct fairly often because once you introduce a term that you're going to use an abbreviation for, you're going to want to consistently use that abbreviation through the rest of your paper. It may be slightly different in chapters in your dissertation, and Samara can speak to that, but in your course papers, if you introduce a topic, you're just going to want to continue to use that abbreviation afterwards. Also, um, even if it is something that is very obvious to you, if you are going to use an abbreviation, you're going to want to make sure that you introduce it first. So I find that to be an error as well. Even if it's like the abbreviation for your type of psychology or your department or something like that, if it's super common to you, it's not always going to be common to your reader. So I wanted to point that out as well. Another example down here, major depressive disorder is a chronic psychiatric disorder, and then you follow it through with MDD. And we'll talk a little bit about the capitalization in a second. Can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah. So the next one is hyphenation. In general, words that have prefixes are not hyphenated. So things like non, semi, pre, post, anti, multi, inter. This is something that is sometimes difficult, especially when, if you're like me, any little mark in MS Word makes me kind of freak out, like, what did I do wrong? Sometimes MS Word just does not know the word that you're talking about, but that doesn't mean that you did it incorrectly if you didn't put a hyphen. So just make sure if you're adding a prefix to something, usually you just push the word together. Things like pre-test and post-test, those things are always going to be just a word without a hyphen. But anything that uses the word self is going to be hyphenated. So self-esteem, self-efficacy, anything like that. So I know it's a little bit nuanced, but generally all prefixes are not hyphenated, but self always is.
So Lydia, we have a
So
question.
go ahead.
The question is,
Mhm.
how would you enter the date for a reference, before or after the abbreviation is placed?
Okay, actually, I talk about that in just a minute. So if you will hold on to that for me for a second, you're going to see an example. And I think that that will be helpful. Um, so hold on to that for me for a second. So the next one is capitalization. This one is pretty straightforward. You're going to capitalize the first word of every sentence. You're going to capitalize all proper nouns, so names of things. You do not capitalize the names of models or theories. So very general things like the theory of learned behavior is not capitalized. You also do not capitalize the names of disorders or diseases. So I know this seems a little bit counterintuitive because I just said you capitalize proper nouns, but proper nouns are like someone's name, whereas this is just the name of something you're discussing, and so it's not a proper noun. And it's important that you make sure you do that. But you do capitalize abbreviations even if you didn't capitalize the word. So for example, MDD is major depressive disorder, but you wouldn't capitalize major depressive disorder inside a sentence, but you would capitalize the abbreviation. And it just helps us know that you're talking about an abbreviation.
So we do have a
The
question.
next slide, go ahead.
I have a question related to
Go ahead.
this. If many abbreviations are
Mhm.
used, can one add a page listing all the abbreviations early in the paper, for instance, before the table of contents?
Um, I'm I might defer that to you, Samara. I am not familiar with something like in a course paper, you would definitely not do that. But for a longer paper,
Yeah, I
go
agree.
ahead.
You would not do that. There's no need for that. If you're writing the dissertation, for example, you do have
Mhm.
your definitions of key terms section, but that is again terms, and some of those might have abbreviations, but you do not list your abbreviations separately. You just include them in your narrative as we've described, and then once you spell it out and establish the abbreviation, you can use the abbreviation through the rest of the paper. I do recommend that, if something, say, like PTSD, if you in chapter 1 you spell that out with PTSD, maybe in chapter 3 when you use it again, If you have not been using it, if you use it again in chapter 3, you might spell it out the first time in chapter 3, just to remind your reader what it is, but you don't need a separate abbreviations page.
And one good thing to think about when you're wondering whether or not you should clarify that abbreviation is think about someone who is not in your field who may or may not know what you're talking about, because you're introducing that term, letting somebody know this is what I'm talking about, and then you use the abbreviation. And so I know that in the Writing Center, in the Online Writing Center, we look at all different types of psychology papers, and often I'm reading along and I'm like, I have no idea what that means because I don't do ABA or something different. So I just keep in mind that if it's something that you're abbreviating, you're trying to explain that to your reader in the text so that they know what you're talking about as you continue.
Yeah, so we have another follow-up question about the question is it okay to have a glossary section in a paper? And I think we've pretty much covered that, and the answer is no. There's no need for
Mm,
that. Again, you may have a definition of key terms, but those key terms are going to be really unusual terms. And then anything on any abbreviations or terms are going to really define in the narrative. I should mention that it does depend on your program, that there may be some exception to that, but generally we're not going to have abbreviation pages or glossaries. And if you
right.
need a
Yeah.
template for your program coordinators have access to those templates. And we do use those templates in the Writing Center to make sure that we are following um, those any exceptions or anything that's specific to a program. We do follow those. Uh, okay, Lydia, I just have a couple more questions. Unusual terms, they're
Okay.
terms of art. They are terms that are specific perhaps to the study that you're conducting or specific to perhaps um, the the theory that you're studying. There are things that you're, again, as Lydia has said, your reader may not know, and so they need some special attention. That definition of key terms section in the dissertation is not, 5 pages long. It's a couple.
Mm.
It's those true terms that really are unusual and they need some special attention. Let's see, is it okay to use an abbreviation for a specific theory such as social identity theory? Yes. The way that you wrote it in the question though is social identity theory is not capitalized, but the abbreviation in the parentheses is. Great questions. Please keep them coming. All right.
We're ready to move on.
Quotation marks.
All right, so quotation marks. So in APA style, you're using double quotation marks to refer to a word or phrase as a linguistic example. So if you're speaking about the letter Q, then you're going to put Q in quotation marks. Or if you're talking about the way someone responded to something, yes or no, those are going to go in quotation marks. You um, you definitely don't want to use quotation marks just because something is a key term necessarily, only if you're talking about that term as a linguistic example. Also, um, stimuli, the stimulus words like incentive, money, things like that, or when you are directly quoting something. So the reproduction of material verbatim, that is also in double quotation marks. You can also introduce a word or phrase used as an ironic comment, slang, or invented. So, like, quote, normal behavior. But this is a little tricky because sometimes I see in students writing that like they would put like terms in quotation marks when really it's not an ironic comment, it's not slang term, it's just a word that is being used to describe something. So you want to be real careful with quotation marks. They have very specific uses. Also, and Samara, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know that there is a use for a single quotation mark in APA writing. like grammatically there's a reason for it, but if you're setting things apart, you're always using those double quotation marks.
That's correct. I can't think of anything, any reason why you'd use a single quotation mark. And again,
Right.
I want to be
So,
clear and really just second what Lydia said, that there are some specific uses for double quotation marks, but they're not particularly common except for the direct quote. So yeah, it can get a little
right.
bit
The last one I
complicated.
did, I thought,
There I'm getting a little information about a reason why you would use single quotation marks, but it's not very common.
mhm.
So go ahead.
Generally you're using those double quotation marks unless it's a grammatical reason, um, which is a little complicated.
Right.
Um,
And again, we can do some specifics again at the end. I want to make sure
sure.
we're addressing some of these questions. I did just get another one about capitalization, and I'm glad this came up because it's a little bit of a nuance. So the question is, what if there's a proper name associated with the theory or the model? So the example that's been provided here is Weisbord's 6-box model. And the question is, would that be, well, I guess it's small, if it's lowercase everywhere. Do you want to respond, Lydia?
Sure. So if it belongs to someone, um, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, then you're going to capitalize the proper noun, which is the name Maslow, and then you're going to not capitalize hierarchy of needs because that's going to be the theory that he promoted. So that is not a proper name.
Does that make
I hope that answered your
sense?
question.
Yeah, I was thinking about Freud's theory of psychoanalysis. You capitalize Freud, but you don't capitalize the rest.
Right. So proper nouns are really like people's names. That's generally what a proper noun is. So if you're talking about the person who identified the theory, then yes, you capitalize their name, but what they did is not capitalized,
Correct. Yep.
what they produced.
Yep. It's a little bit of a nuance, and I'm sure Lydia catches it too, and I do as well. And we try to provide the example to help it. And Lydia said it. It's a little counterintuitive because it feels like you should capitalize those things, but you don't.
Mhm. Yeah,
Another
yeah,
question
yeah.
here. Let me make sure I get this right. So we do not need to quote a word or phrase or just the reference the quote. So I think the question is, if the word or phrase is a direct quote from a reference, then you would use double quotation marks.
I'm
Is
a
that,
little confused about that question.
yeah. So we do not, oh, we do not need to quote a word or phrase or just reference the quote. So where I try to go, maybe again, we can show this. Sometimes these things are a little easier when you can see them. If you look at the slide here, it says reproduce material verbatim. The authors noted, quote, most participants were tired after the lesson, end quote. So that's a direct quote. Anytime I try to err on the side of anytime I'm directly quoting something from a reference, I use the double quotations and I cite it. That way I'm covered. Maybe a little bit of
Yeah.
overkill, but I think it's always safer to make sure that it's clear that is not my wording. If that did not answer the question, please ask again. But let's carry on and we
Sure.
can come back to that one.
Okay. So in addition to the other times that you use quotation marks, you there's a couple of other little ones. I think we went over them, but in addition, there's italics. And so sometimes I see people using quotation marks when they should be using italics. And so you're going to use italics to identify key terms or phrases that are followed by a definition. So this example here, cyberbullying, you're going to put that in italics. You're setting that word apart, but it's with italics that it's important. Also, to identify anchors of the scale. So 1 is strongly disagree and 5 is strongly agree. So I would really encourage you, if this part of the talk is a little bit confusing to you, on the Online Writing Center website, we have there's a really nifty tool that you can click on, that you click on quotation marks and it gives you great examples. You click on italics and it gives you really good examples. It's a really concrete way. I actually personally use that even when I'm tutoring, to go, wait, let me make sure, because sometimes your intention is you know it needs to be set apart, but you're unsure if it's quotation marks or italics, and that's a really helpful tool.
Totally agree. I use it myself to make sure that I'm saying the right thing when I'm looking at someone's work. Question, should I put a book's name in italics?
Um, yes, in the reference page, if you're talking about it in the text, I would say yes, still you're referencing a book. But correct me if I'm wrong somewhere, because I'm not really strong about with that.
You are correct. In the reference page, in the reference entry, you will italicize the name of a book. You will italicize the name of a journal. You will, I believe, and
Mhm.
I may need to be corrected if I'm wrong, if you use the name of the book in the narrative, you will need to italicize the title of the book. You would
Mhm. I
italicize,
would say yes.
yeah, you would italicize the title of a movie if you were mentioning the movie title itself.
Yes.
Okay,
Any
so
other questions?
yes, there are. Um, I will be
Okay.
sure to put a link to the Writing Center page that we were just talking about in the chat when we're finished. I've gotten 2 updates that you would use single quotations to mark a quote within a quote, which gets
Right.
very complicated and um,
That's what I was referring to when I said
yep,
for a grammatical reason.
that's
So
right.
that doesn't have really anything to do with APA style. That is grammar.
That's correct, and it's not particularly common. And then I have a
Right.
question now about italics. What about Latin expressions?
Um, it de- it depends on how you're using it. Because like for example, some of the Latin expressions we use like IE or EG, no, you just write it. Um, but I think it depends on how you're using it. If you're using it in one of these ways, like a term you're about to define, then you would need to do that, but not because it was Latin, but because it was a term you were defining. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, so should I use quotation marks for quotes 40 words or less from a qualitative participant?
Anytime you are verbatim quoting somebody that is not yourself, you should quote it as far as I'm concerned. The 40 words or less has to do with the blocking, but anytime you're quoting someone, you need to put those quotation marks just to
So,
be safe. That's what
yep,
I would do.
yes, I was going to say the exact same thing. Double quotation marks when you are quoting your qualitative participant. If that direct quote is 40 words or more, then you use the block quote format, and you do
Mm,
not put quotation marks around a block quote.
right.
These are great questions. All right, italics. Let's verb tense.
All right. So anytime you are discussing something that you read that is already published, you will use the past tense or the present perfect tense. Generally, it's easier to just write in past tense because then you don't mess up those helping verbs. So present perfect tense is something like have found, but past tense is found, noted, wrote, discussed, observed, any of those things. It's just much easier to write in past tense, in my opinion, because it's usually just one word.
Yes, it's
Um,
stronger writing, it's clearer, and we avoid the
mhm.
passive voice as well.
Yes. The passive voice is really easy to slip into when you're using a different tense besides past tense. So, yeah, I would just stick with that past tense. Use one verb, say exactly what you mean, and be clear with that. All right. All right. So pronouns. Every pronoun should refer clearly to its antecedent, and that is the word that it's referring to. So if you're going to use if you're using a pronoun, it needs to be very clear what that pronoun represents. And sometimes it's confusing if you're writing along and you're a couple sentences down and you're still using a pronoun. Make sure that it's very clear what it's referring back to. In order to avoid ambiguity, you'll use a personal pronoun rather than the third person when describing steps taken in your experiment. So you wouldn't say the researcher will, you would say I will. Um, I will caution you to say that on coursework, papers, you're going to want to make sure that the first person is acceptable to your professor. Because in my experience, it has not been very often. So you want to be careful to refer to yourself unless you actually did the thing. So here, the example is something that you did. You actually did that experiment. So you want to be real careful with that. And just check with your professor. That's what I would say about that. The other one is don't use we to refer to people in general. It's called the editorial we. And so it's kind of like um, when you're talking along and if you mean like most people know this, you wouldn't say we all know this, you would say most people. You don't want to generalize using that second person we. It just kind of takes it down from academic writing. It makes it a little more casual, and you can't assume that people belong to any one group. So just want to make sure that you're using very specific words. So instead of we tend to rely, you would say nurses, doctors, teachers, psychologists. Like, say the word you mean specifically. It just makes more clear and concise writing as well. To continue with pronouns, so APA 7 made the distinction that the word they is a singular term. So this really clears up some of the confusion from before where you were using like he or she or a combination of those words put together. So to refer to a person, you're going to identify they as the preferred pronoun, and it is a generic third person singular pronoun to refer to someone whose gender is unknown or it's not important to know. So if you're talking about a participant and you have participants of both genders or whatever, or any kind of gender, you're just going to say there because it doesn't identify anything. Also, um, this is kind of a grammatical change in APA, because before, if you said a child, you would use a singular pronoun, but now they is singular. So you can say a child should learn to play by themselves as opposed to himself or herself. Also, you're not using he or she or any of those combinations, he slash she or she slash he, any of those things. You're just going to say they or them. To me, this makes writing so much clearer and easier because it was a little complicated before. So page 121 of the 7th edition shows you how to reword some things to make sure that you're avoiding awkward phrasing. Personally, I think this makes life easier. So this is one of the changes that I really like. Any other questions before we move on about pronouns?
Yeah, we did get the question right before you started talking about it about he or she. What form of
Uh-huh.
verb should I use after the they instead of he or she?
So you're going to use the singular verb if it is appropriate. So if you're talking about like a child should play by him, you normally would have said himself or herself. Now we say themselves. But if you're using it as a verb, like they went to the store, then you just use the verb that goes with they. if that makes sense. So you would never say they was happy because that is a singular verb, but that's not proper grammar. So you're going to use the verb that goes with the word they. Does that answer the question?
Yes.
I hope so.
What if you are conducting a gender-specific study?
I'm going to defer that to you, Samara, um,
So,
because I mean, I know
yeah,
I've seen, but
yeah, that's an interesting question. You would use the gender pronouns if it is specific. I think where it can get nuanced is if a participant were to identify themselves as a they,
Mhm.
even though they are presenting perhaps visually as a woman, for example, but they informed the researcher that they wanted to be identified as with they, then the researcher would honor that. These guidelines
Mhm.
about using the they, it's new, and it's, as Lydia said, it's for when gender doesn't matter to the writing or
Mhm.
to the presentation, where, like the example here, each participant turned in their test. What's important is that the tests were turned in. It doesn't matter if it was men or women. But if it's a gender specific study, then yes, you would use those specific pronouns.
Mm. I think it's important to remember that this pronoun is not to take the place of he or she if that's appropriate. It's really to fix those times when gender is either unknown or not important. So before you would have to like kind of take into account any gender. Here, this is just a kind of all-encompassing word if you needed that, and it's just really a grammatical change.
Agree.
All right, any other questions about pronouns? All
Not
right.
yet.
All right, so a few other things. The first one is do not underline or use bold font unless it's in a direct quote. So if even if you're trying to really emphasize something, you're not going to underline or bold it. You just are going to use your language to emphasize it. Headings, however, will be bold. And so think of it in the way that headings are really important and you want that to really stand out. So you're not going to ever have underlined or bolded font in the text because then somebody's going to think it's a heading. Use your language to place emphasis there. Also, ellipses are not appropriate before or after direct quotes. So even if the sentence, if you started in the middle of a sentence where you were quoting, just begin your quote there. Don't use those ellipses before or after. So that's just not important. Also, you're not going to use back-to-back parentheses. So this goes back to that question we had earlier with capitalization. If you'll click the button one more time, there's a really good example. So you're not going to do the top one where too much information is TMI, open, close parentheses, and then open a new one for the citation. You will use a semicolon. So you'll open your parentheses and put your abbreviation there, then put a semicolon, and then begin your citation. So that's a really good question. And I knew it was coming up. So I hope that you see that there. This happens sometimes. I'll be honest and say sometimes I'm like, oh wait, what am I supposed to do? Um, and I would just say before I hand it back over, I know I plugged the resource, the APA resource page on the Writing Center's website. It is so helpful and so really well organized. Even as a student, I appreciate it. I use it all the time, and I would encourage you because these kinds of questions, these little nuanced things, they're available there, and so I just want to encourage you to use that. We're happy to answer any more questions because I know we've talked about so many things. So
Yes, we
please,
have. I have some questions, and I know that I promised to show how to format a table, and I'm happy to stay for a few minutes beyond our hour to do that. What if you shorten a quote, as in, I guess, the question is, would you use ellipses to show there's more material following, but you wanted to just focus on a certain portion of the quote?
no. So if you're going to end your quote, in the middle of, if you started and ended your quotation in the middle of a sentence or in the middle of a body of work or whatever, you're not going to do that. So ellipses is only if you took something out of the middle of the quote that you used. So you're not going to enter a quote with ellipses or exit a quote with ellipses. That's not important.
So you're just going to use it in the middle, say. Like, do not use
Right.
ellipses, points, dot, dot, dot. Do not lead in or out of a quote. So you can use the ellipses in the
Right.
middle, but not at the beginning or the end. Let's
Yes.
see. So people I know have to drop off. So you will get a recording. It will be sent to you as an attendee or a registrant to this. So you should get an email with the recording of this. If you haven't gotten it by the end of the week, you can definitely reach out, but you should get that in email. We also post our webinars on our website as well, so you could access it from our webpage. Another question, let's see, for ellipses, we are no longer to use them even if we're just using a sentence fragment as a direct quote.
Right. So only if it's at the beginning or the end of that quote. You're not going to you're not going to put double quotation marks, ellipses, and then start writing. You wouldn't do that. Just quote what you're quoting. That's acceptable, even if it's a part of a sentence.
Okay, and I did promise to post a link to our webpage in the chat, so let me grab that and I will get that into the chat. Move that. Give me just a second on that. And I should be able to show this really fantastic page. In fact, I'll just link to that. Just a second, let me get this. Okay, so that should have gone out to everybody. If you click on the chat in your box, that should show up there. A couple more questions for, whoops, where'd it go? For bullet points, should I put periods after each line? So a bulleted list?
I actually know the answer to this. You only do that if it's a sentence. If you wrote a complete sentence, then yes, you need a period. If your list is something that's just a phrase or a couple of words or whatever, you would not put a period at the end of all of those.
That's correct, yep. I know sometimes I have to stop and visualize it and wait, what? Okay, so I think I am now sharing our website. You should be able to see that. So I'm just gonna scroll a little bit. So here's our 7th edition transition guide. So it shows you the rules, some of which we talked about just now. It shows the 7th edition, how it was in the 6th, and then a little short what has changed to make it hopefully as clear as possible. I check this all the time when I'm trying to make sure I'm switching back and forth. This, I think, Lydia, is what you were talking about, which is so
Yes.
helpful. So, oh, I need to cite 3 authors. What does that look like? So you just come and you click on 3 authors, and then it shows you how to do the parenthetical citation and the inline citation. It's just so great. And you just click on these and you get exactly what you need. Then the next chunk is the reference list. So I need to cite a journal article, and here it gives you all the examples you could possibly need. This is just so easy and wonderful. So I would get this bookmarked as soon as you can. Same here, we've
This is
got,
the section, yeah, that's what I was talking about. That formatting section is so helpful because you can click quotation marks and you can see these are the things that I would put in quotation marks. And then if you click italics, it gives you some more examples about exactly what would be in italics. And I think those are so very helpful. I use them all of the time just to kind of help myself even as we go along. So that formatting section is very helpful.
Yep, I use it too. Here's a sample of the cover page. And if you click on these dots, it gives you more information about what is being discussed and shown. It's just brilliant. There's some other tools here. You can just click on those and get that information. I come here for a headings reminder every time just to make sure I'm doing it right. I can't say enough about this page. So here's the tables and the figures, and I'll show how to do that in just a moment. Keep promising, it's really going to happen. So just be sure to come and use this page as much as you can. I also wanted to show really quickly that on our homepage, here's where you can schedule a one-on-one writing review. This is not synchronous. I do need to be clear. This is where you can make an appointment to have Lydia or me we allot an hour-long appointments, and we will review your document. So a chapter of a dissertation or a course paper, and we'll provide feedback and through comments and track changes so that you can go do your revision. These are not line by line edits or proofreading appointments, but you will get really good feedback that will help you again with that practice of academic writing. We'll have the webinars. We do keep them here so you can refer back. Some interactive tools for APA we just showed. And here you can link to some of the things as well, just a different way to get there. So we hope our webpage is really helpful and that you'll reach out to us. So now, as promised, let me show how to format a table. And let me pull up just a blank document. Okay, so if you're going to create a table, so you can see the default font is Calibri, and that is fine in this circumstance. Okay, so my table is bold. Then the title is italicized, and then I'm going to create the table. And the easiest way that I have found to do this is to insert a table. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to do it this way. So 3. Really quickly. Okay, so again, what's important here is that all of these border lines need to go away. So the easiest way that, again, I have found, and there are, as you know in Word, a lot of different ways to do this, is to come back home to the border tool collection. I would take away all of the borders. So now there's still, you can still manage your table the same way, but those border lines are gone. But we still need, for the header row, we still need a top and a bottom border line. So you can just simply choose bottom border and top border, and now this is correctly formatted for APA. For your bottom row, you need a bottom line. So you come back up here, you highlight the bottom row, come back up here and select bottom border, and then make sure, I believe everything is centered in a table. Everything is correct there, and this row does need to be bold. So that is how to format a table correctly with the correct lines. So you could have 100 rows, but they don't have those vertical border lines. And there's only a bottom border line at the bottom of the table. And then underneath you'd have a note. And the word note is italicized. So Lydia, let me know if I got that wrong, but I think I captured how to put a table together.
No, I think it looks right. Absolutely.
Okay, terrific. So what other questions? And thank you all for attending. I can see some thank yous coming through, and we appreciate the feedback and the attention.
Absolutely.
This
Thank
was
you
a
guys so
lot.
much.
Yeah, sorry, Lydia, but this was a
You're
lot
fine.
of information. Again, all of this takes a lot of practice. All of us in the Writing Center, we do sort of do this every day. So it's a little more comfortable. But the more you write, the more you practice, the easier it all gets. And we're here to help. So please reach out to us.
Absolutely.
All right. I'm happy to make sure there aren't any more questions, but that is everything that we have to share this evening. I'm seeing, Lydia, just for your reference, I'm seeing lots of thank yous. Somebody's putting this to work right now in his dissertation.
Awesome.
Tomorrow, yep, citations, lots more detail there. Please join.
Absolutely. Those are very helpful.